Good night, everybody, on this NATO night where we celebrate and reflect upon those 70 years of NATO. The organization of tonight is very curious to hear and to see your views on NATO. So let's kick off with some questions for you. What's the first word that pops to mind when you think of NATO? Sure, that security is still very important. The Netherlands should provide military support in case of an attack of a NATO member state. Seems that you are agreeing largely on this one. Thank you for sharing your opinion. We'll start with the panel giving you a broader overview of the challenges that NATO is facing. Dear panel, please come on stage. Our modest assignment for tonight is to give the audience an overview on the main challenges NATO faces in the near future. Will NATO make it for another 70 years? And what is, in your opinion, the most important challenge for NATO?
Definitely, I think it will make it for another 70 years. What I think is important is to keep the ties with the United States, transatlantic relation. I think that's an important challenge at the moment, but it will also be, I think, in the years to come. But also to adapt to all kinds of new threats, whether it's Russia, we have China on the agenda now, we have a lot of things to do in the south, and that's all important work for NATO to do in the upcoming decades, I would say.
Charlotte, I wanted to ask you, working for the German Marshall Fund, has your job made you more enthusiastic or more critical on NATO?
More enthusiastic, because the more I come to learn about NATO through my job, is the more respect I have for this organization.
Respect, that's a big word.
Respect, yes, because of all the challenges that we will, as a panel, discuss tonight.
Okay, name the most important one.
I think the most important challenge for NATO is to be able to explain not just to the types of people in this room that are big fans of NATO, but especially to the people that might not be the biggest fans of NATO, don't really know what NATO does, to explain its relevance.
Okay, I'll come back to it. Very good. Dieuwertje, Kuijpers, journalist. What is the biggest misunderstanding, also considering opinion polls in general, about NATO that you come across as a journalist?
Overall, what I found really interesting is that there are big difference between mass opinion, public opinion, and elite opinion. I think mass public opinion is way more tolerant and way more open to NATO than actually politicians think they are.
So that's a
very interesting finding. Yes.
Yes, interesting. And how do you explain it?
Politicians always have to take note of public opinion, but sometimes they already think they know what the public might think, and sort of preemptively act on that, without really looking at what the opinion polls are actually saying.
Naomi, Haar, what for you is the first word that pops to mind when you think of NATO?
Allies, I would say, or unity. I mean, I think that's the strong point of NATO, is that we are united, that we are among friends, that we have shared values.
Let's zoom in on the role of the US within the NATO. Of course, for many people, the image now is the question, of course, of loyalty of the US to the NATO, especially, of course, raised by the actions of the American president, who raised questions on the loyalty of the US to NATO. But interestingly, as Professor Charles Kupchan recently wrote in Foreign Affairs, he said NATO is thriving in spite of President Trump.
Support in the United States for NATO has always been big. I mean, and I don't know whether it's in spite or thanks to President Trump, but I think everyone realizes that the current geopolitical situation, the challenges that emerge, they ask of NATO to be strong and united. And I think that is a big reason why people actually come out and say, we have this set of values, they might be challenged, we need to work together to address those.
Bas, moving to you, what are the signs about the American commitment to NATO that you get within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs?
Well, I think the US is still very committed. If you see what's happening in Congress, And we have this bipartisan support, this legislation with a very big support in Congress. I think that's very important. And what you also see now, we had, of course, maybe sometimes a bit difficult discussions at the last summit in Brussels in 2018. But you see from the side of the White House and others, there's very strong commitment to NATO. You see that from the US government, they're also happy that we have extra financial funds added to NATO. So I think that maybe also there the perception in Washington is shifting a bit when compared to 1 or 2 years ago.
Of course, NATO has spent most of the past 70 years focusing on how to defend the continent against Russia.
I think that NATO is best fit when you talk about the so-called collective defense of Europe and its European allies. You have 70 years of experience. There's a very important and well-functioning military structure. And I think that is when you're talking about countering the threats coming from Russia, I think the organization best fit to deal with these challenges.
For example, this enhanced forward present operation portrayed in the Russian media. What did you pick up on that perspective?
Well, when I was serving in Moscow, I was always surprised how much they see NATO as a threat. And you see it also in all the official doctrines, but you see it also on Russian state television, in the media. It's very visible. I have the idea, and that's my personal view, that it also has to do a bit with internal politics in Russia itself. That by creating a foreign enemy, it supports the regime, internal support. Well, they have all kinds of issues, economic problems and so on, that plays a role as well. On the other hand, there's also, I think, in Russia a certain historical perspective. They have been invaded by France, they have been invaded by Germany a couple of times, and that's also, I think, still in the Russian mentality is still there.
That said, what is, in your opinion, the main challenge then for the eastern flank, summarizing?
In a certain way is what Ismay said in I think it was in 1950s, to keep the Russians out and to make sure that in the Baltic states, in Poland and other places, they not will engage in any foreign adventure.
I would actually use this moment in the discussion to open up for questions from the audience.
So yeah, my name is Haar, I'm from Ukraine. I'm the student of Ukrainian Leadership Academy. Right now, the situation in Ukraine and Russia, like the relationship is really difficult. It's more difficult than ever, I guess. This is the relevant question for the NATO. In case of what if, I mean, any kind of escalation of conflict, what is the strategy or the plan concerning Ukraine?
I think that what happened to Ukraine and in relation to Russia, I mean, it has been on the top of NATO agenda for the last 5 years. I mean, it's very clear the violation of international law, what Russia has done in the Crimea and other places in Ukraine, is of big concern. And I think we have been very supportive to Ukraine from the side of NATO in the last 5 years. On the other hand, it's also very clear, and I'll be frank with you, Ukraine is at the moment is not in NATO. And I think that will take a long time. You need to push through a whole reform process. But I think the commitment from the side of all NATO countries, including the Netherlands, to Ukraine, I think is a very strong one.
We have to leave it there. Thank you very much for participating in this session. Round of applause for our guests being here, so bravely answering your questions. Marisa, Gerards, would you be so kind to join me on stage? Very pleased to have you here. Let me briefly introduce you. For those of you who don't know you, Permanent Representative, that's the official title of the Kingdom of the Netherlands to NATO, our ambassador in the NATO headquarters. Right. So, you've only started working there just a couple of months ago, last year, right?
Yeah, half a year ago.
Half a year ago. How do you experience this new environment?
I'm back to paper. You know, everything was on iPads and everything was... But now, because it's all secret, confidential, restricted, it goes through different systems. And so I'm back to paper. Everything is confidential. I enter the building. I have to lock up my telephone. Then you suddenly are in meeting rooms with no windows and you cannot bring in any devices. And so it's totally different, but it's very interesting because these are the geopolitical questions of our time. So there's a lot happening at this moment in time, and that's what we feel on a daily basis also at NATO, I think. What is interesting, once that you are in Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa and South Africa, and you look at the world, you suddenly see and you feel on a daily basis the global shift.
What, in your opinion, is the most important challenge that you see for NATO?
Yeah. Well, what I find really a challenge for NATO is if you look at the treaty, and I would advise everybody have a look at the treaty, and you can see the famous Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all. It's very much based on the idea of the nation state. One nation state attacking the other one on a kind of obvious, visible, way. What I find the biggest challenge for NATO is how to deal with non-state actors. How to deal with hybrid, cyber, Are we attacked? Are we not attacked? How does it work? How do we do that? And I can see that's a kind of a struggle. We said that cyber is a domain for NATO, like air, land, seas. Article 5 is in force. But how and when? When are you attacked? Where's the threshold? How does it work? We didn't figure it out yet.
Could you give us another insight behind the scenes a bit on how on a daily basis you still deal with the Russians? I mean, they are still in the NATO-Russia Council, right?
It is difficult at the moment, but we at NATO, we have this dual-track approach of deterrence and defense, and from a position of strength, look for a meaningful dialogue. Because we don't want to isolate Russia. They are our neighbor. We want to cooperate, and you're looking for better times. You want to convince each other as well. Although we don't agree on many subjects, it's also very important, I think, from the perspective of risk reduction.
Would you say that within your NATO headquarters that you managed to really have this broad perspective, this open view towards those interconnected
threats? Let me give a very political answer, and it's yes and no. Because in a way we do, because if you look what NATO is about, we try to broaden our scope. But then, again, you look through that kind of straw of security issues. And you were talking about China before. Is China a threat? I don't know. It was called a strategic competitor, I think, by the EU. It's also a partner. We do a lot of trade with them. Yes, there are challenges, but there are also opportunities. How do we deal with it? And a lot of the threats, if we call it threats, are on the economic side. Because we are, one of our values is our liberal open economy. And China's part of it. China's part of our liberal open economy. And on the one hand, we're happy with it, but on the other hand, we're waking up now and we see that yes, they're part of our liberal economy, but they play by different rules. They play by different rules, and that makes it very difficult because they are a state-led economy, and they give huge subsidies, and they exclude our companies, and that's a threat. But is it a threat we are dealing with as NATO? No, not really. But then again, if you have 5G on the agenda and it's about communication, or it's about investing in the infrastructure and harbors in Europe, it's suddenly about military mobility as well. And our communication systems, if they're not safe or they can be switched off, suddenly also our armed forces cannot communicate anymore. So then suddenly it's also on our plate.
What I have not really addressed yet with the panel is the question of the expansion of NATO. What is the process that precedes this expansion, and do you foresee a difficult process?
You have to be a European country, share the same values, and you have to add to the security of the alliance. Those are a few things mentioned in the Article 10, and then you need consensus in order to be able to enter. So also for Ukraine and Georgia, who are very loyal and very good partners at this moment in time of NATO, they will go through this process as well, and it will be discussed, and countries will decide on their opinion, and let's see where we are.
Let's see where we are in the audience.
Whoop. My question is basically, we've been talking a lot about NATO in general, addressing the threats or the future of NATO and the challenges to NATO in general. I was wondering if there's anything specific that the Netherlands in specific is addressing.
Well, one of the subjects, and then I'm looking at the staff of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and of Defense, was military mobility, wasn't it? That was before I arrived, because it was at the summit in Brussels where decisions were taken around military mobility, because now that collective defense is back on our agenda, we suddenly realize that we have been neglecting a lot of our collective defense because we all thought and hoped that Russia would become a partner of NATO. And suddenly we realized that, I think Bas already said it, that there were a lot of budget cuts in the different ministries of defense, so there was a lot of neglect. But also we realized that the infrastructure was not up to standard anymore. So we have to invest. And this is one of the subjects where the Netherlands took the lead, both in NATO as well as in the EU.
I was wondering, A, what your position is on autonomous weapons, and B, what NATO is and what is happening at the NATO scene regarding this. I know the EU is doing a lot, the UN is doing a lot, but I'm curious about NATO. Thanks a lot.
Well, if you ask me personally, I think it's very scary. I think it's very scary. And it's absolutely also on the radar for NATO. We're discussing emerging technologies, artificial intelligence, these autonomous weapons. So what I see is that it's intensively discussed, but I don't see the solutions yet.
What would be your ultimate advice for those of people here who would aspire a career in international relations?
I think you have to be very inquisitive. I think you have to read, study, travel, network, talk to a lot of people, you know, make sure that you know what's going around. My second advice would be very critical of the information that you get in this time. Because what I notice as well when I speak to young people, very often they don't read a newspaper anymore, or they don't have a subscription to The Economist, but they just get their information from the social media and the internet. And I think also, you know, get yourself a newspaper and read The Economist, because these newspapers, they really have a reputation to lose. And the third one would be, because I talked to our daughter this morning, and I said, I'm going to meet all these you know, students and interns and people who are looking for an international career. And I said to her, what would be your advice? And she said to me, tell them, don't worry too much and enjoy your life.
Thank you very much for your advice. Thanks for being here. We hope to see you back next year then at NATO 220. And for a last final word, I'll give the microphone to the chair of the Jonge Atlantici.
Yep. Now, I had the pleasure last week to join the celebration at NATO. NATO Engages, I should say. And there's one thing that I wanted to take with me from there to you. So these are the words from Secretary Madeleine Albright. She was reflecting on what NATO would like in 10 years from now, NATO 80. And she was referring to our generation. We could be known as a generation that allowed technology to drive a deeper wedge within and between nations, or as the visionaries who harness technology to unite people and expand freedom. We, you, could be known as a generation that allowed democratic momentum to shift into reverse, or as the leaders whose efforts helped revive democracy within the transatlantic community and beyond. We could be known as a generation that allowed NATO to become paralyzed in the face of freedom's foes, or the doers who forged a renewed alliance which became the bulwark of support for liberty around the equator and from pole to pole. This choice is up to us. The current generation of leaders are aggravated against this idea that we would be future leaders. It really is up to us now. If we want to shape the upcoming 10 years, we have to make these decisions. Now, that's all for me. We get to the drink part. Thank you once again, and see you next year when we celebrate 70 years of NATO.